The morning of March 16, 1890, dawned grey over Washington, the kind of grey that carried the scent of rain and the promise of an unsettled day. St. Paul's Baptist Church, a modest but proud building of weathered brick and stained glass, stood as a pillar in the black community. Inside, the air was heavy with the mingled aroma of candle wax, polished wood, and damp wool coats. The pews were filled to their limits, men in pressed suits and worn boots, women in long skirts and bonnets, children fidgeting under the watchful eyes of their mothers. All waited for the man they had come to hear, Reverend Elijah Porter. Elijah was more than a pastor. In a time when the weight of prejudice pressed down on every opportunity, he was a voice of courage, a steady hand guiding his congregation through storms both spiritual and worldly. His sermons were not simply recitations of scripture. They were calls to endurance, laced with the conviction that God had not forgotten them. There was a quiet charisma about him, something that lingered long after he stepped down from the pulpit. That morning, his voice rolled through the rafters, deep and deliberate, each word carrying a gravity that seemed to silence even the restless children. "The Lord is our refuge and strength," he began, his gaze sweeping over the congregation, "a very present help in trouble." His hands moved as he spoke, not in dramatic flourishes, but in subtle emphasis, as though he was placing each word carefully into the hearts of his listeners. But something was different that day. Those closest to him noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he gripped the pulpit, the way his eyes drifted, just for a heartbeat, to the church's front doors, as though he were expecting someone or something to arrive. In his Bible, tucked between Psalms and Isaiah, there was a scrap of paper, and during a pause in the sermon, he glanced at it almost unconsciously, his lips tightening. Outside, a cold wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the sound of a lone carriage passing by. Inside, the congregation leaned forward as Elijah's tone shifted from hope to warning. "Not all that comes to us is of God," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "There are forces in this world that move unseen, that whisper in the dark, and they come not to bless, but to steal away the light." The words hung in the air like a shadow. Then, as if shaking himself from some inner thought, Elijah smiled faintly, closed his Bible, and began the benediction. The final hymn was sung, hands were shaken, children were ushered toward the door. People lingered in the aisles, speaking in hushed voices about the strange tone of the sermon. And then he was gone. At first, no one noticed. The deacons assumed he had slipped into his study. His sister, Ruth, thought he had gone to fetch a coat. But when they searched the small rooms behind the sanctuary, they found only his Bible, lying open on the desk, the scrap of paper gone. The back door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges, a thin trail of muddy footprints leading to the edge of the churchyard before disappearing in the wet grass. No one in the neighborhood had seen him leave. No carriages had stopped nearby. There had been no sound of struggle, no cry for help. It was as though the pastor had been swallowed whole by the grey afternoon. The police came quickly, but their search yielded nothing. Questioning turned to speculation. Speculation to rumor. Some whispered that he had been taken by men in dark coats, strangers seen loitering near the church in the days before. Others believed he had received a divine summons, that he had simply walked away to fulfill a higher calling. A few, in quieter voices, muttered about curses, about spirits that walked in the shadows between the living and the dead. In the days that followed, St. Paul's felt emptier than it should have, even when the pews were full. The absence of Elijah Porter was more than the loss of a man. It was the silencing of a voice that had kept despair at bay. On the third Sunday without him, Ruth stood in the pulpit, her voice breaking as she read from the book of Psalms, the same verse he had begun with on that final day. "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." Years later, an elderly member of the congregation would recall that morning with a shiver. "He was looking at that door," she said, "like he knew it was coming for him, and when it did, it didn't make a sound. And so, the name of Reverend Elijah Porter passed into the stories told in Washington's back streets and church basements, a name wrapped in mystery, spoken in both reverence and unease. What happened to him that day was anyone's guess. But the truth was stranger than anyone could have imagined, and it would not be revealed until 20 years later in a place no one thought to look. In the weeks after Reverend Elijah Porter's disappearance, Washington's heart seemed to beat slower. The city still bustled with horse-drawn carriages rattling down rain-slick cobblestone streets, and street lamps still glowed in the misty evenings. But in the neighborhood surrounding St. Paul's Baptist Church, something had shifted. It was as though an invisible veil had been drawn over the community, a tension that made people glance over their shoulders or lower their voices when strangers passed. At first, the absence of Elijah was spoken of in public terms, in ways the polite world could understand. A tragedy, people would say. Perhaps he had family business in the South. Perhaps he's ill. But behind closed doors, when the curtains were drawn and lamps were turned low, the conversations took on a darker tone. People began to recount small, unnerving moments from the weeks before his vanishing. One deacon remembered seeing two white men in long coats standing across the street from the church late at night. They didn't speak to anyone, didn't move except to shift their weight, their hats pulled low over their faces. Another congregant swore that 3 days before Elijah's last sermon, she'd seen him arguing with a stranger in the alley behind the church. A tall man with an oddly deliberate way of speaking, as though English wasn't his first language. Elijah's voice had been low, urgent, and she'd caught only one word before they noticed her: leave. Rumors began to circulate that the pastor had stumbled onto something he was never meant to know. Some whispered of a secret society, men in positions of influence who met in basements lit by a single candle, who conducted strange rites and swore oaths never to be spoken in daylight. Others said Elijah had been marked for death because he'd preached too boldly against injustices in the city, naming names that powerful men wanted forgotten. But the most unsettling rumor was the one few dared to voice: that Elijah had been visited by something not entirely human. The janitor of the church, an old man named Isaac Bell, told a story to anyone who would listen, though most tried not to. He claimed that one night, well after midnight, he had returned to fetch his forgotten coat. The church was dark except for a single light seeping out from under the pastor's study door. As he approached, Isaac heard two voices. One was Elijah's. The other was wrong. It was low, almost a growl, but threaded with a strange resonance that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He swore the words were in no language he knew. When he knocked, the voices ceased instantly. Elijah opened the door a crack, his eyes wide and tense, and told Isaac to go home. Now, he'd said, and shut the door before Isaac could reply. By the end of the month, the police had filed their report. No foul play detected. Case closed unless new evidence emerges. To the congregation, this was an insult. Elijah Porter had been a man of routine, a man who never vanished without word. The official silence only deepened the speculation. Ruth Porter, Elijah's sister, kept her grief tightly bound, but those close to her noticed her change. She began making trips across the city, to libraries, to government buildings, even to the port along the waterfront. Once she returned home late at night, her dress wet with rain, carrying a bundle of old newspapers. When asked, she said she was following a thread. It was in one of those newspapers, an obscure evening edition from 3 weeks before Elijah's disappearance, that she found something curious. On the 4th page, sandwiched between shipping notices and grain prices, was a small advertisement: seeking men of courage and conviction, a test of faith and secrecy. Meet at the corner of 9th and Worthington, midnight, March 10th. The ad was unsigned. The printing was clean but unremarkable. And yet, scrawled faintly in pencil at the bottom of the clipping, was Elijah's own handwriting. "This is not for them. This is for me." Ruth kept the clipping in a locked box under her bed. She told no one, Not the police, not the congregation, not even Isaac Bell. But from that day forward, she no longer believed her brother's disappearance had been an accident. Something had reached into their lives and taken him. Something powerful enough to keep the truth hidden. In the following weeks, the whispers only grew. Some claimed Elijah had been spotted on a ferry bound for the Puget Sound. Others insisted they'd seen him in a boarding house in Oregon. But no one could produce proof. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, a ghost whose name could still quiet a room. Years would pass before the truth began to surface, but in 1890 the rumors were all they had. And the most persistent rumor of all was the one people feared to say aloud. Elijah Porter hadn't just left. He'd been called, and whatever had called him was still out there. The years following Reverend Elijah Porter's disappearance were like a long gray winter for the congregation of St. Paul's Baptist Church. Washington grew and changed. Streetcar lines extended farther. New buildings of stone and glass replaced the old wooden shops, and the sound of industry echoed from the shipyards. But in the heart of the black community, Elijah's absence was a wound that never healed. For a time, Ruth Porter tried to keep the church's spirit alive. She arranged for guest preachers, organized charity drives, and visited every sickbed in the neighborhood. Yet she knew it wasn't the same. Elijah had been more than a pastor. He had been the voice that made people believe they could withstand anything, even the invisible storms of prejudice and poverty. Without him, something vital had slipped away. As the years passed, the mystery became a kind of local legend. Children who had been restless in his sermons grew into adults who told the story to their own children, embellishing it with each retelling. Some claimed he had been taken by men in the night. Others whispered of the dark caller who had lured him away. Isaac Bell, the old janitor, still swore he'd heard that strange, inhuman voice. And when the weather turned cold and the wind howled through the streets, he would mutter, "Sounds just like it." But Ruth was the only one who refused to treat it as a story. For 2 decades, she followed every rumor. She traveled beyond Washington whenever she could afford it. South to Richmond, north to Baltimore, and once even west to Chicago, always chasing faint trails. Most were dead ends. A man who looked like Elijah in a train station turned out to be a stranger. A letter sent to her from Oregon, claiming to be from her brother, dissolved into a hoax after she traced the handwriting to a man in debt. Still, there were moments when the past stirred in ways that made her pause. Once in 1898, a package arrived at her door. It contained nothing but a leather-bound Bible, Elijah's Bible, with a page torn from the book of Isaiah folded inside. The passage was Isaiah 45:3. "I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places." There was no note, no return address. By 1905, Ruth was no longer a young woman. Her hair had streaked with silver. Her hands bore the calluses of years of work, and the sharp ache in her knees made every winter harder. But her determination had not faded. She kept a journal, page after page of clipped articles, maps, dates, and names. And in the margins, she often wrote questions to her brother as if he could read them. Why did you leave? Who took you? Are you safe? Meanwhile, the city around her was forgetting. The younger generation rolled their eyes at the old stories. Newspapers no longer mentioned the case. Even the church had moved on, appointing a permanent new pastor who rarely spoke Elijah's name from the pulpit. And yet, there were those small, haunting moments when it felt as if the past was still watching. One summer evening in 1909, as Ruth walked home from a meeting, she noticed a man standing in the shadows across the street. He was tall, his hat pulled low, his coat buttoned even in the warm air. She quickened her pace. At the next corner, she glanced back, and he was gone, though there was nowhere for him to have vanished so quickly. The next morning, she found another note slipped under her door. It was written in the same deliberate hand as the Bible's scripture. It read, "Not yet, but soon." For 20 years, Elijah Porter existed as a figure half remembered and half feared, a name spoken in whispers, a man lost in the fog of time. Yet somewhere, Ruth was certain of it, he was alive. She could feel it in the way the hair rose on her arms when she passed the old church at night, in the way strangers' eyes lingered on her just a little too long. And she was right. Because in the summer of 1910, in a remote village far from Washington's brick streets and flickering gas lamps, a traveler would see a face that had haunted the city for 2 decades. And that face would not be the face of a ghost. It would be older, weathered, and very much alive. It was the summer of 1910 when the first real sighting of Reverend Elijah Porter in 20 years would come. Not in Washington, not in any bustling city, but in a place so far removed from the world he had once known that it might as well have been another century. The account came from a man named Thomas Avery, a traveling merchant who specialized in selling provisions to logging camps scattered across the Pacific Northwest. Thomas had been making his way through a stretch of dense forest near the foothills of the Cascade Range, where the air smelled of pine resin and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rhythmic groan of his mule and the occasional call of a distant bird. The trail was narrow and overgrown, more a suggestion of a path than a road, and by the time the sun began to sink, Thomas knew he would need to find shelter for the night. That was when he stumbled upon it. A village that was not on any map he carried. It sat in a low valley, surrounded by tall evergreens, the buildings simple wooden structures with moss creeping up their sides. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the faint sound of voices carried through the cooling air. There was something strange about the place, though Thomas couldn't immediately say what. The villagers who emerged to greet him did so politely enough, but their expressions were guarded, their eyes sharp. It was as he dismounted near the central well that Thomas saw him. Standing a few paces away, watching with a mixture of curiosity and caution, was an older man whose presence seemed to quiet the air around him. His hair, once black, was now streaked with gray, his beard neatly trimmed, his posture upright despite the years. But it was the eyes that caught Thomas, eyes that seemed to hold the memory of storms weathered and secrets kept. For a moment, Thomas simply stared, certain he had seen that face before, and then it came to him, like the flash of a match in the dark. Washington, the missing pastor. He had heard the story as a boy, how Reverend Elijah Porter had vanished in 1890, leaving behind only questions. To see him here, 2 decades later, alive and seemingly well, was almost beyond belief. Thomas approached cautiously, tipping his hat. "Evening, sir," he said. The older man inclined his head in greeting, but said nothing. There was a hesitation in his manner, as if he were weighing whether to acknowledge the stranger at all. "You look familiar," Thomas ventured. "Ever spent time in Washington?" The man's gaze lingered on him for a long moment, unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice deep but measured. "I've been many places. Washington was a long time ago." It was enough to confirm Thomas's suspicion. He wanted to press further, to ask where Elijah had been all these years, why he had never returned. But there was something in the pastor's tone, a quiet finality, that made him hold back. That night, Thomas was given a place to sleep in a small guest cabin at the edge of the village. From his window, he could see the central square lit by the warm glow of lanterns. The people moved about their business without hurry, yet there was a subtle rhythm to their interactions, as though everything they did was guided by an unspoken set of rules. Elijah was among them, speaking in low tones to a few men near the well. They stood close together, heads bent, and every so often one of them would glance toward the cabin, as if to make sure Thomas was not watching. The next morning, when Thomas prepared to leave, Elijah approached him. In the daylight, Thomas could see the lines etched deep into his face, the way his eyes seemed to look past the moment, as though he were carrying the weight of more years than had passed. "You'll forget you saw me here," Elijah said quietly, not as a threat, but as a plea. "There are reasons I can't go back, reasons you wouldn't understand, and reasons you wouldn't be safe knowing." Thomas wanted to ask more, but the pastor's expression closed the conversation. He mounted his mule and rode away, The image of the hidden village burned into his memory, and though he would try, he never could forget the look in Elijah Porter's eyes, a look that held both relief and sorrow, as if he were a man standing between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. When Thomas finally reached the nearest town with a telegraph office, he hesitated before sending word. In the end, the message he wired to Washington was brief. Ruth Porter saw your brother, alive, different, in a place that doesn't want to be found. When Ruth Porter received the telegram, her hands trembled so violently she almost tore the paper in half. She read it once, then again, her breath catching on the same 3 words each time. Saw your brother. It had been so long since anyone had dared claim they had truly seen him that her first instinct was disbelief. But the name of the sender, Thomas Avery, was unfamiliar, and that made it feel different. Not another cruel hoax from someone in the neighborhood, not one of the endless rumors whispered in back rooms. This was new. Within weeks, Ruth had arranged for Thomas to visit her in Washington. He arrived on a rainy evening, his coat dripping, his boots heavy with mud from the road. Over a pot of coffee at her kitchen table, he recounted everything. The remote village, the guarded expressions, the sight of Elijah by the well. He described the way her brother had looked. Older, yes, but unmistakably himself, with a gravity in his eyes that made it clear he had lived through things he would never speak of lightly. Ruth listened in silence, her hands clenched in her lap. When Thomas finished, she asked only one question. Did he say my name? Thomas hesitated. No, but he knew I was from Washington. He knew exactly who I meant when I asked if he'd been there before. That was enough. Within days, Ruth was on the road. She traveled by train, then by wagon, following Thomas's directions to the letter. The final leg was on foot, through thick forest and steep terrain, until she reached the hidden village. It was late afternoon when she saw him. He was sitting on a bench outside one of the wooden buildings, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, Ruth simply stood there, afraid to move, afraid to break the fragile reality of the moment. Then he turned, and their eyes met. Elijah, she whispered. He rose slowly, his face unreadable, and walked toward her. For a heartbeat, she thought he might embrace her. Instead, he stopped a few feet away. You shouldn't have come here, he said quietly. I've been looking for you for 20 years, she replied, her voice shaking. Do you know what that's been like? I do, he said, and there was something in his tone, a deep sadness that made her chest tighten. And I am sorry, but I can't go back with you. They talked in the shadow of the trees, away from the curious eyes of the villagers. It was then that Elijah began to speak, not all at once, but in halting pieces, as though each word was a weight he had to measure before releasing it. He told her that in the weeks before his disappearance, he had been approached by a man he called the Messenger. This man had known things, private things, that no stranger could have known. He had spoken of a hidden gathering, a test of conviction and faith, and had warned Elijah that if he refused to attend, the entire congregation of St. Paul's would face consequences. Elijah had gone, not out of curiosity, but out of fear for those under his care. What he found was not a meeting in the ordinary sense. It was an initiation into something older, something he described only as the Order. The men there were not all strangers. Some were powerful figures from Washington society. Others were outsiders with strange, deliberate accents. They spoke of prophecy, of guarding the treasure of darkness mentioned in Isaiah, and of a duty that required leaving behind everything one loved. I thought I could resist them, Elijah told her, his eyes dark in the fading light. But once I knew what they were guarding, I couldn't turn away, and I couldn't let it be known. That's why I left. If I had stayed, you and everyone else would have been in danger. Ruth pressed him for details. What was the treasure? What danger? But he shook his head. Even speaking of it here risks too much. You wouldn't understand until you've seen it, and if you see it, you can't go back. There was something in his voice that chilled her more than any threat could have. It wasn't fear for himself, it was fear for her. As night fell, Elijah walked her to the edge of the village. "Forget this place," he said. "Forget me. The life I had is gone." But Ruth knew she couldn't, and as she made her way back through the forest, the words he'd spoken clung to her like damp clothes. "Once you've seen it, you can't go back." Ruth Porter returned to Washington carrying the heavy weight of both relief and devastation. She had found her brother, yes, but she had not brought him home. The image of Elijah standing in the dim forest light, his voice low, warning her to forget everything, replayed in her mind each night like the echo of a dream she couldn't shake. In the weeks after her return, she told almost no one about the encounter. The few she confided in, the old friends of the family, a couple of trusted neighbors, reacted with disbelief, insisting that she must have mistaken someone else for Elijah. But Ruth knew. She could still remember the way he had said her name, the way his eyes, though older, still held the same depth they had when they were children in their parents' small farmhouse. It was nearly 6 months later when the first letter arrived. It was postmarked from a small town in Oregon, but the handwriting, neat, deliberate, was unmistakably Elijah's. The envelope was thin, and inside was only a single page with a brief message. "Ruth, you must understand that I am where I am meant to be. The world you know is not the only one. There are doors you cannot see until you are standing in front of them, and once opened, they do not close. Remember Isaiah 45:3. Ruth fetched her old family Bible and turned to the verse, "I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by thy name, am the God of Israel." The words struck her in the chest like a blow. Elijah had mentioned the treasure of darkness during their meeting, but she had thought it symbolic. Now it seemed to be at the heart of whatever had claimed him. Over the next year, Ruth received 2 more letters. Both were sparse, offering no details of his location, but always laced with scripture references, each one hinting at guardianship, hidden knowledge, and the burden of keeping a sacred trust. She began to wonder if Elijah had been drawn into some ancient covenant, or worse, if he had been trapped by it. Then, just as suddenly as the letters had begun, they stopped. Months passed, then years. Ruth grew older, her hair turning silver, but she never stopped scanning the post for his handwriting. Sometimes she would catch herself staring at the horizon, half expecting to see him walking down the road toward her. It was in the winter of 1924, 34 years after Elijah's first disappearance, that she received the final trace of him. A package arrived at her doorstep, wrapped in thick oilcloth with no return address. Inside was a leather-bound journal, weathered and scarred, smelling faintly of smoke. Most of the pages had been torn out, leaving only fragments of handwriting scattered like broken thoughts. One entry, however, remained intact. It read, "The work is almost done. Soon the weight will pass to another. Whether they guard it or squander it is beyond my control. I only pray they understand what it costs to keep the darkness contained. If you are reading this, Ruth, then know that I never stopped thinking of you, and that some truths are kinder left in shadow." There was no signature, but in the back cover, pressed into the leather so faintly it could be missed at first glance, was a small symbol, a closed eye. Ruth never saw Elijah again. Some said he had gone deeper into the wilderness. Others whispered that he had joined some cloistered sect in the mountains, guarding something ancient until the end of his days. But for Ruth, the mystery was not one of geography. It was of purpose. She kept the journal in a locked drawer for the rest of her life, taking it out only on quiet nights when the wind rattled the windows and the past felt close enough to touch. And each time she read that final line, "Some truths are kinder left in shadow," she would wonder whether Elijah's absence had been a sacrifice or a choice. Either way, the story had no ending she could write, only an unfinished chapter, bound in leather, smelling of smoke, and heavy with the weight of what would never be known. If this story left you with questions burning in your mind and a curiosity that won't let go, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we uncover hidden histories, untold mysteries, and true events stranger than fiction. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think happened to Elijah? Your theories might just shape our next investigation. Don't let the truth slip into the shadows. Join us and keep the search alive.